Before I begin my story, I want to ask you something. Do you have any family members who lived through or witnessed World War II? If so, tell me in the comments. I want to know where you're watching from, what city you live in, and if your family also carries memories that have spanned generations. These stories, however painful, should never be forgotten. My name is Eleanor Whitford. I am 77 years old. I am a British boomer, and today I finally decided to tell what my mother experienced, and what she only revealed to me when she was already at the end of her life. My name is Eleanor Whitford, and as I look back from the vantage point of 77 years of life, I can see how the earliest pieces of my childhood were shaped by things I did not understand at the time. Growing up in Bristol in the early 1950s meant living in a country that was trying to rebuild itself, brick by brick, after years of devastation. Even though the war had ended before I was born, its presence was everywhere. It lived in the cracks of the pavement, in the empty lots where houses used to stand, in the cautious looks exchanged between adults when certain topics surfaced. I absorbed these fragments without context, carrying them like unanswered questions. My mother, Margaret, rarely spoke about her past. She had a calmness about her that felt deliberate, as if she carefully arranged every expression and every word to avoid revealing something hidden beneath. I grew up feeling that silence just as strongly as other children felt the presence of grandparents or family stories. Whenever a siren sounded during the monthly civil defense tests, she would pause, close her hands tightly, then continue what she was doing without explanation. I learned not to ask, though curiosity quietly followed me through each passing year. Our small home sat in a neighborhood that still bore traces of earlier destruction. Some mornings, when the fog was thin, I could see the remains of a collapsed brick wall at the end of the street, its jagged edges softened only slightly by time. Adults called those places bomb gaps, a term that sounded almost clinical to my young mind. I did not understand what it meant to lose buildings or people to something so sudden, yet I sensed the weight of it in the way neighbors stopped to look at those empty spaces, not for the structures that were gone, but for the memories attached to them. My mother had a habit of humming while she cooked. It was a soft melody with a rhythm that never repeated itself in the same way. I asked her once where she had learned it, and she answered that she did not remember it. But I caught a flicker in her eyes, a fleeting moment of recognition that she quickly tucked away. That small shift, barely noticeable, stayed with me. I began listening more closely to everything she did, searching for clues to the life she refused to describe. Even as a child, I felt different from my friends, who seemed to have families full of lively stories. They spoke about uncles who traveled, aunts who played in old dance halls, or grandparents who met during wartime dances. Their memories sounded romantic in a way that felt foreign to me. My mother spoke only of the present. My schoolwork, my shoes, the weather. She talked as if the past were a locked drawer she refused to open. The first time I realized something deeper lingered in her silence was on a winter evening when I was 8. A neighbor had brought over a radio she no longer needed. My mother thanked her kindly and placed it in the corner of the kitchen. That night, when I turned the dial and stumbled upon a program that played old wartime broadcasts, her reaction startled me. She crossed the room quickly and switched it off, her breath caught in her throat. She told me it was late and that I should go to bed. But her voice was strained, as though she was holding back a memory she did not want to resurface. I lay awake that night, replaying the moment in my mind. It was then that I understood, in an instinctive way, that the war had touched her directly, not through distant relatives or stories passed down, but through lived experience she could not escape. From that day on, I became more attuned to the little signs she tried to conceal. I remember walking with her one afternoon past an old church whose roof had never been replaced. The stones were blackened, the windows still boarded. She stopped for a moment and looked at it with an expression I had never seen, one that held sadness and a kind of quiet respect. I asked if she used to go there. She hesitated before answering, saying only that it had been important to many families in the area. The way she said it made me feel as though she were speaking of a loss that reached far beyond the building itself. As I grew older, I noticed how she avoided large crowds or loud gatherings. Fireworks made her retreat indoors, even during community celebrations. She always managed to mask her reactions with polite excuses, but the tension in her shoulders betrayed her. At the time, I did not understand trauma or the lingering echoes of fear. I only knew my mother was carrying something she refused to lay down. Looking back now, I can see how deeply those early moments shaped me. They taught me to observe, to listen, to notice the stories that people hide behind their expressions. I did not realize it then, but I was already beginning a journey that would eventually lead me to uncover the truth she had kept buried for decades. In those early years, I simply existed in the quiet shadow of her unspoken past, unaware that one day that past would reshape everything I thought I knew about her and about myself. She carried this silence with a fragile strength that touched every part of our home, shaping the rhythm of our days and the atmosphere of our nights. She carried this silence with a fragile strength that touched every part of our home, shaping the rhythm of our days and the atmosphere of our nights. She carried this silence with a fragile strength that touched every part of our home, shaping the rhythm of our days and the atmosphere of our nights. She carried this silence with a fragile strength that touched every part of our home, shaping the rhythm of our days and the atmosphere of our nights. She carried this silence with a fragile strength that touched every part of our home, shaping the rhythm of our days and the atmosphere of our nights. She carried this silence with a fragile strength that touched every part of our home, shaping the rhythm of our days and the atmosphere of our nights. She carried this silence with a fragile strength that touched every part of our home, shaping the rhythm of our days and the atmosphere of our nights. She carried this silence with a fragile strength that touched every part of our home, shaping the rhythm of our days and the atmosphere of our nights. She carried this silence with a fragile strength that touched every part of our home, shaping the rhythm of our days and the atmosphere of our nights. She carried this silence with a fragile strength that touched every part of our home, shaping the rhythm of our days and the atmosphere of our nights. As I stepped further into my teenage years, the atmosphere inside our home changed in ways that were subtle enough to escape casual notice, but strong enough to shape the person. I eventually became my mother's silence, which I had once accepted as a natural part of her personality, began to feel deliberate. There were moments when she seemed present and warm, yet her eyes held a distance, as though she carried memories that she refused to allow into the light. I often caught her staring at the sky on quiet afternoons, her expression unreadable, as if waiting for something she hoped would never return. School became a contrast to the life I lived indoors. My friends embraced the excitement of the 1960s with a kind of careless optimism that I envied. They talked about music, travel, fashion, bold dreams, and a future filled with possibilities. While the United Kingdom was moving into a new era of expression and confidence, I remained anchored to questions I could not ask. Whenever the subject of the war surfaced in class, I felt a tightening in my chest, wondering what my mother had experienced and why she worked so hard to hide it. Small details became clues. The sound of heavy lorries passing on the road made her pause. The smell of burning wood from distant chimneys caused her to close windows even on mild days. When neighbors reminisced about rationing or shelters, she would excuse herself with a polite smile. Her reactions were controlled and quiet, but to me they spoke loudly. I wrote these observations in a notebook I kept hidden beneath my bed, unsure of what I hoped to discover. Perhaps I needed evidence that the feelings I sensed were not imagined. One evening, after dinner, I gathered enough courage to ask her whether she had ever felt afraid during the war. She paused while washing a plate, letting the water run for a moment before answering. She told me fear was something people learned to ignore when survival depended on continuing with ordinary tasks. Her tone was steady, yet the look in her eyes betrayed a deeper truth. Instead of explaining further, she dried her hands and asked about my schoolwork. I realized then that she had constructed walls around her memories, offering only glimpses when she lost her balance for a heartbeat. As our neighborhood changed and new families moved into previously abandoned houses, I became fascinated by the streets my mother avoided. There was one narrow lane with houses marked by age and weather. She never walked through it, choosing instead to take a longer route home. I once attempted to ask why, but she dismissed the question gently. That small refusal stayed with me, pulling at my curiosity until I could not ignore it. I walked the lane alone one afternoon, noticing an old shelter entrance partially hidden behind overgrown hedges. I wondered whether she had stood there decades earlier, listening to sounds that no child should ever hear. Evenings in our house were quiet. My mother sat in her armchair, a book open but rarely read. Her gaze often drifted, unfocused, as though something far away held her attention. Sometimes I sat across from her, pretending to study, but truly observing the way her posture softened when she slipped into thought. She never spoke about those moments, but I sensed they were not pleasant memories. They seemed more like shadows rising behind her, heavy enough to alter her breathing. There were times when I wanted to reach out and ask directly what she had endured. I imagined sitting beside her, taking her hand, telling her that I was old enough to hear the truth. But each time the opportunity appeared, her tightly controlled calmness reminded me that forcing her would only build thicker walls. Instead, I learned to listen to the silence. It held meaning, even if I could not yet interpret it. By the time I turned 15, I had grown used to the quiet tension that shaped our household. I understood that my mother carried something unresolved, something that lingered in her expressions, her hesitations, her carefully measured words. She was not fragile, but she lived with an awareness that extended beyond the ordinary concerns of daily life. I sensed her scanning crowds subtly, avoiding certain news reports, steering us away from bustling events that might overwhelm her. To others, these choices looked like preference. To me, they looked like survival. Looking back, I believe that period defined the beginning of my awareness. It taught me to perceive the emotions people hide behind practiced smiles. It prepared me for the truth she would one day reveal, a truth that would shift the foundation of what I thought I knew about her life before I was born. At the time, however, all I had were small pieces of a larger story she kept locked inside herself. I did not yet understand the reason for her silence, but I could feel its influence in every room of our home. Still, despite her guarded behavior, there were moments of warmth that reminded me she was trying to protect me rather than distance herself. She made sure I never felt unsafe. She encouraged my studies, listened to my worries, and held me close when I cried over small teenage disappointments. Her love was steady, even if her past was not. I began to realize that whatever she had endured, she did not want it to define my life. Yet her silence, though protective, left me with unanswered questions that grew heavier with each passing year. Those early teenage years became a quiet bridge between my childhood innocence and the understanding that true stories are not always freely told. They must be earned through patience, compassion, and the courage to listen. And although I did not know it then, the day was coming when my mother would finally unlock the memories she had carried alone for so long. I woke before dawn, startled by a strange stillness that didn't belong to the world I had known during those years. For days, my town had lived in a rhythm of distant tension, a pulse I never fully understood as a child, but felt deeply in the way adults whispered and paused at every unexpected sound. That morning, however, there was no movement, no murmured conversations, no nervous clatter of footsteps. Only a silence so complete it made the air feel heavier. I remember sitting up and sensing that something was different, as if the world itself was holding its breath. My mother was already awake, seated at the edge of the kitchen table. Her hands were clasped tightly, knuckles pale, and she kept staring at the window as though it could warn her of whatever approached. She didn't speak, and I didn't ask anything. We had learned to communicate through expressions alone, through small looks exchanged during uncertain days. Her eyes carried a weight I didn't understand then, a mixture of fatigue and determination that shaped the person I later became. When my grandfather stepped into the room, he carried the same expression he always had, one built from years of resilience. I didn't know his full story back then, nor the secrets he held so firmly, but I knew the atmosphere shifted whenever he entered it. He placed a hand on my shoulder and quietly told us we might need to stay indoors for the rest of the day. His voice wasn't panicked, only firm, like someone delivering instructions he had repeated many times in his life. Around mid-morning, the silence broke. It started as a vibration under the floorboards. A low, trembling eye felt through my bare feet. I looked to my mother, and she immediately reached for my hand. The trembling grew into a deep rumble, one that seemed to move through the sky rather than the ground. My grandfather didn't look surprised. He simply closed the shutters and motioned for us to stay together near the center of the house. I followed every gesture, even without fully understanding why we had to do it. The sound outside intensified, but nothing struck our town directly. Instead, the noise passed overhead in long, echoing waves. I remember expecting something catastrophic, but nothing happened. The vibrations lingered, humming through the walls until they abruptly faded into the distance. When everything stopped, the silence returned, thicker than before. My grandfather finally exhaled, as though he had been holding his breath along with the rest of us. He stepped outside for a moment, and I watched from the doorway. The sky looked the same, the street unchanged, but I could sense something in him shifting. When he came back inside, he sat down, stared at his hands, and for the first time since I had known him, he looked unguarded. That afternoon, he told me a story, not the full truth, but a version meant to protect me. He spoke about responsibility, about moments when a person must stand firm, even when fear presses against every part of them. I listened, mesmerized by the gentle steadiness in his voice. He didn't describe battles or dangers. Instead, he spoke about choices, about how the past could shape a person more than any noise in the sky. It was only decades later that I learned how much he had left unsaid. As evening approached, neighbors cautiously stepped outside. People exchanged glances rather than words, as if speaking too loudly might awaken something. My mother kept me close, and my grandfather walked beside us with quiet authority. The town square, usually busy, felt abandoned, though a few families emerged just long enough to reassure themselves that everything was still standing. That night, as I lay in bed, I realized how deeply that day had marked me. Not because of fear, but because of the strange calm that followed it. It was the first time I understood that silence could be heavier than noise. It was also the moment I began paying attention to the way my grandfather carried his past, hidden beneath a mask of steady composure. Years later, when I finally learned the truth he kept from us, I returned to this memory and understood it differently. The silence that morning had reminded him of another place, another time he rarely spoke about. The vibrations, the rumbling, the tension in the air, those were echoes of a world he had once known too intimately. A world he tried, for my sake, to leave behind. What I didn't know then was that this day would become the turning point in my childhood. It was the moment when I sensed that the adults around me were shaped by histories I couldn't yet imagine. It was also the moment when I first realized that my grandfather's life held mysteries far greater than I understood. Only much later did I pieced together how deeply those hidden truths connected to the journey my family would face in the years ahead. For several days after that unsettling morning, my grandfather avoided any conversation that touched on the events we had experienced. He kept himself busy with small tasks around the house, repairing things that didn't truly need fixing, cleaning tools he barely used. My mother noticed. Of course, she had always been able to read him better than anyone. Still, she respected his silence, even when it stretched far longer than usual. I, however, found myself watching him differently, sensing there was something beneath the surface that he was trying to hide, something that the noise in the sky had awoken. One evening, after my mother had gone to bed, I found him sitting alone in the backyard. The air was cold, and the moon cast a faint glow on the worn wooden fence. He seemed lost in thought, staring at the ground as though he was searching for something buried beneath it. When he noticed me, he straightened up quickly, attempting to hide the heaviness in his expression. I sat beside him without speaking, and for a while we simply listened to the wind moving through the trees. He eventually broke the silence with a question that seemed to come from somewhere far deeper than our quiet backyard. He asked if the noise from the other day had frightened me. I told him it had, but only because I didn't know what was happening. He nodded, as if my answer confirmed something he had already suspected. He then looked at me with an intensity that made me sit up straighter. He said there were things from his past that he had never spoken about, things he believed were better kept hidden. But sometimes, he said, staying silent becomes harder than speaking. He didn't tell me everything that night. Instead, he shared a small piece of his story, something he believed I was old enough to understand. He spoke of a time when he was much younger, when he found himself responsible for helping people who had lost nearly everything. He said he never considered himself a hero, only someone who did what he thought was right. But even simple acts, he explained, can leave deep marks on a person, especially when the world around them is changing faster than they can comprehend. His voice remained steady, but I sensed the weight behind every word. He described long days filled with uncertainty, times when he had to make decisions that followed him for years. He didn't mention any harsh details, and he avoided anything that would burden me with fear or distress. Instead, he spoke of resilience, of how people often hold on to hope even in the most unpredictable circumstances. He told me that the noise we heard reminded him of moments he had long tried to forget, moments that shaped the person he eventually became. I listened carefully, trying to imagine the younger version of him facing those challenges. I had never thought of him as anything other than the steady, protective figure in my life. Yet now I began to see that he carried layers of experience I had never noticed before. When he finished speaking, he looked relieved, as though sharing even a small fragment of his memories had lightened something within him. Over the next few days, he seemed more at peace. He still kept plenty to himself, but the tension in his shoulders softened. My mother watched him with quiet curiosity, sensing the shift but choosing not to pry. She had always respected the boundaries he set, even when those boundaries left her with questions of her own. I think she understood better than anyone that some parts of his past were locked away not out of pride, but out of a desire to protect us from the weight of history. One afternoon, he handed me an old wooden box that I had seen many times, but never paid attention to. He told me not to open it yet, but to keep it safe. He said there would come a day when I would understand why it mattered. His expression carried a seriousness I had rarely seen in him. I nodded, even though I didn't understand the significance of the box or the reason he entrusted it to me. At the time, it felt like a simple gesture. Only later did I realize how much meaning it held. In the weeks that followed, life settled into a fragile normality. The noise in the sky became a distant memory, something neighbors only whispered about when they felt certain no one else was listening. Yet the atmosphere of caution lingered, as if the entire town had been reminded of its own vulnerability. I noticed my mother taking extra care with everything she did, as though preparing for possibilities she could not name. And my grandfather, though calmer, remained quietly vigilant, listening for sounds others couldn't hear. It wasn't until many years later that I understood the full truth behind his silence and the deeper meaning of the story he shared with me that night. But in that moment, sitting with him under the moonlight, I felt the first glimpse of the legacy he carried and the reason he guarded it so carefully. That night was the beginning of a revelation that would shape the path my life eventually followed, connecting me to a past I would one day uncover piece by piece. I was 19 when I first truly understood that my mother carried a history far heavier than the daily rhythms of our life suggested. It was a crisp autumn morning, the kind where the air in Bristol carries a sharp chill that awakens every nerve. I had returned from university, eager to share some small triumphs, unaware that the day would reveal a dimension of my mother I had never seen before. She was in the kitchen when I arrived, carefully arranging dishes on the counter. I greeted her with the usual warmth, but she barely responded. Her eyes seemed distant, fixed on something beyond the walls of the house. I asked if she was feeling well, but she only nodded and continued her work, her movements precise but rigid. I sensed tension radiating from her like an invisible weight pressing down on everything in the room. It was different from the quiet she always maintained. It was a trembling undercurrent I couldn't ignore. Suddenly, a sharp sound outside startled both of Usa Lorry's brakes squealing on the nearby street. My mother froze. Her hands gripped the edge of the counter, knuckles white. She let out a short, almost inaudible gasp, and then, unexpectedly, she sank to the floor, her knees giving way beneath her. I dropped the bag I had been carrying and knelt beside her, my heart racing. She was conscious but shaking violently, a shuddering that seemed to shake the house itself. I had never seen her like this. Fear, raw and unfiltered, had taken control. I held her close, whispering reassurances, though I barely knew what to say. She clung to me with surprising strength, her breath rapid and eyes wide with something I could not immediately name. I realized, with a chill that went through my spine, that what I was witnessing was not merely anxiety, was a memory surfacing, a ghost from a time she had tried to bury. My mother, the woman who had been my anchor and protector, was reliving something that had happened decades before, long before I was born. Once she calmed slightly, she began speaking, her words trembling as they escaped her lips. She spoke in fragments, describing nights filled with sirens and explosions. The constant fear of not knowing whether her home or her neighbors would survive the day. She talked about running through streets that had once been familiar, now reduced to rubble. I listened in silence, letting her fill the space between us with stories that had been locked away for as long as I had known her. Her voice wavered, but her determination to speak was clear. This was a truth she had carried alone, and in that moment she entrusted it to me. She spoke of rationing, the sound of distant planes, the sudden and terrifying hush of the air before an air raid. She told me about friends and neighbors who never returned, about buildings that had vanished overnight, and about the small, fleeting moments of hope that kept her moving forward. Every detail she shared was vivid, painted with emotions I had never imagined she could carry in silence. But I could feel the tension she had absorbed and held, the fear that had clung to her through decades of quiet life. I held her as she spoke, amazed by the strength it took for her to finally reveal these memories. Her words were fragmented, but the essence of her experience was clear. She had survived terror, loss, and uncertainty, and in doing so had become someone I had never fully understood until that day. The room seemed to pulse with the weight of history, and I realized how much of her life had been dedicated to shielding me from the darkness she had endured. By the evening, her trembling had subsided, though exhaustion had taken its place. She leaned against me, her head resting on my shoulder, and we sat together in silence, the house quiet around us. I understood then that our bond had shifted. I was no longer merely her daughter. I had become a witness to her survival, a keeper of a past that had been hidden from view for decades. But that day marked a turning point, not only in our relationship, but in my understanding of the resilience of those who had endured the war and carried its weight in ways that were invisible to the world. As I helped her to bed, I reflected on how fragile yet enduring the human spirit can be. My mother had faced horrors I could scarcely imagine, yet she had lived to nurture me, to guide me, and to protect me from the shadows she had carried alone. That night, I vowed silently to remember her story, to honor it and to carry it forward, knowing that some truths are only revealed when the heart is ready to receive them. Even now, decades later, I can recall that morning with vivid clarity. It is a memory that reminds me that survival is more than enduring, is living through the unspoken moments, the tremors of fear that leave invisible marks, and the quiet strength of those who bear histories too heavy for words. That day, my mother showed me the depth of her courage, and I realized that understanding her past was the beginning of understanding my own place in the legacy of our family, shaped by events far beyond our control, but carried forward by love, resilience, and the unbreakable bond between a mother and her child. After the morning my mother had finally spoken of her past, I found myself drawn to parts of the house I had never explored fully. The attic, in particular, had always seemed like a place of secrets. My grandfather rarely entered it, and my mother only referred to it in passing. Yet that day I felt an inexplicable urge to go there, to uncover whatever fragments of memory the house might still be holding. The wooden steps creaked under my weight as I climbed, each sound echoing in the empty space, a quiet reminder that time had preserved much more than dust. Boxes lined the walls, stacked unevenly, some tied with string, others open and exposed to years of shifting air. I ran my fingers along a crate covered in faded fabric, and when I pulled it toward me, the hinges groaned in protest. Inside were bundles of letters tied with ribbon, their edges yellowed with age, ink faded but still legible. I realized at once that these letters were hers, my mother Esand, that they had been hidden here for decades, perhaps because the memories they contained were too painful to confront until she was ready. I hesitated before opening the first bundle, my hands trembling as if I might disturb the life contained within these fragile papers. But curiosity, a force I had carried since childhood, overcame hesitation. The first letter began with simple words, almost mundane, describing daily routines and small observations. Yet, as I read on, I could feel the tension building between the lines. My mother wrote about sirens that tore through the night, the suffocating fear that accompanied every air raid, and the aching absence of friends and neighbors who had disappeared without warning. One letter described a night in particular when she had been 14 years old. The city was under bombardment, and she had found herself running with a small group of children. some younger than herself, through streets that had once been familiar but now seemed like mazes of rubble and smoke. She spoke of holding their hands tightly, whispering reassurances she didn't feel, and praying that they would all survive the chaos. The words, though written decades ago, carried a weight so intense that I felt it as if it were happening around me in that very attic. Another letter recounted the struggle of rationing, the subtle acts of resistance that families undertook to survive, and the tiny moments of hope that sustained them. She wrote of neighbors who shared bread quietly, of games improvised in bombed-out courtyards, and of music hummed softly to drown the terror outside. Every line revealed the resilience she had cultivated, the courage she had developed in a world that demanded endurance far beyond her years. I understood, finally, why she had been so guarded throughout my childhood. These letters were evidence of a life that had demanded maturity too early, a life shaped by fear and perseverance. I continued reading, losing track of time as the attic became a portal into her youth. Each letter offered a fragment of understanding, a glimpse into the world that had forged her. I saw her not only as my mother, but as a survivor, a witness to events that had scarred an entire generation. The more I read, the more I realized how carefully she had protected me, keeping these stories hidden until she believed I could handle the weight of their truth. When I finally closed the last bundle, the attic was quiet once more. I sat among the boxes, the letters resting in my lap, feeling both awe and sorrow. I understood then that these papers were more than memories, they were a bridge to the past. A testament to the life my mother had lived before I existed. They were proof that her strength had been built on hardship, her compassion born from witnessing suffering, and her determination shaped by the need to survive against odds that seemed insurmountable. Later, I descended the creaking stairs carefully, carrying the bundles with reverence. My mother was in the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared tea. I placed the letters on the table, hesitant to speak. She glanced up, and in her eyes I saw recognition, a silent acknowledgement that I had uncovered a part of her she had kept protected. She didn't scold me or show anger. Instead, she poured the tea and sat beside me, a quiet presence that communicated more than words ever could. That evening, we sat together, not speaking much, but both aware that the attic had yielded truths that could no longer remain hidden. I realized that understanding her past was not about asking questions she might avoid. It was about patiently discovering the layers she had built over a lifetime, layer by layer, letter by layer. Those papers were fragile, but the memories they contained were enduring. They became my link to her courage, her fear, and the resilience that had allowed her to survive the war and raise me in safety. Despite the shadows that had followed her through every year of her youth, as I lay in bed that night, I reflected on the power of hidden histories. I thought about how many lives, like my mother's, carry untold stories, buried in attics, drawers, and the quiet corners of homes that seem ordinary. I felt privileged to be the one who could witness her truth. And I understood that survival is not only about living through danger, but also about carrying the memories forward, preserving them for those who come after. That night, I resolved silently to remember every detail, to honor the past, and to let her strength become a guide in my own life, connecting me to the generations who endured, survived, and never gave up. It was late in the spring of my 22nd year when the town experienced an unexpected echo of the past. I had been visiting my mother after a long week at university, seeking the comfort of her kitchen and the familiarity of our conversations. The air smelled faintly of wet pavement from an afternoon rain, a scent I had always associated with change and reflection. I had been poring over the letters I had discovered in the attic, reading once again about the nights she had survived, the moments of fear that had shaped her childhood, and the resilience she had carried forward. Suddenly, the shrill sound of sirens pierced the quiet evening. My body froze, my hands clutching the letters tightly. My mother, who had been chopping vegetables for dinner, stiffened immediately. Her face paled, and her eyes widened in recognition of a sound that should not have been part of our world anymore. I had expected a calm explanation, perhaps reassurance, but instead I saw the ghost of the girl she had once been, the one who had run through streets shrouded in darkness, unsure if she would ever reach safety again. We moved instinctively, following a pattern she had never truly taught me, but that I had memorized. Through years of observation, close the windows, turn off the lights, draw the curtains, and move to the center of the house where walls could protect us. I watched her hands tremble slightly as she locked the doors, the movements precise but heavy with decades of memory. She did not speak. She never needed to. I understood her actions better than words could convey. Her life had been sculpted by fear, and even decades later, the echo of danger could still pull her into those past moments. The sirens wailed for what felt like an eternity, though it was likely only minutes. Outside, the wind carried the sound through narrow streets, bouncing off brick walls, and reminding me that history, though quiet, never fully disappears. I could hear the distant clatter of neighbors checking their windows, the low murmur of families whispering to one another. My mother held my hand tightly, her fingers cold, her grip firm. I felt her heartbeat through her palm, rapid and insistent, a reflection of the rhythm that had sustained her survival as a child. After the sirens stopped, we remained seated in silence. I was too overwhelmed to speak, too aware that I had glimpsed something beyond my understanding. My mother exhaled slowly, as if releasing the air she had been holding since the sound began. She turned to me, her eyes glistening with a mixture of relief and lingering fear. For the first time, I saw her vulnerability so clearly. The woman who had raised me with patience and quiet strength was also the girl who had endured the unimaginable, carrying her past silently through every ordinary day. That night, she told me a fragment of a story I had never heard. She spoke about a night when bombs had fallen close to her home, shaking the ground beneath her feet, and how she had crawled beneath a table with her younger cousins, clinging together for protection. She described the sounds, the metallic echoes, the distant screams, the silence that followed each explosion, and how those sounds had imprinted themselves on her very being. I listened, my own fear rising not from the moment itself, but from the realization that her resilience had been forged under circumstances I could barely imagine. We did not speak again for hours. I stayed close to her, holding her hand, understanding that sometimes presence was more powerful than words. In the quiet that followed, I realized that these moments, the sirens, the fear, the shared memories, were teaching me something fundamental about life and endurance. Trauma, I began to understand, does not always vanish with time. It can lie dormant, waiting for the smallest trigger to remind those who survived of the battles they have carried alone. By morning, the town had returned to its routine. Children played in the streets, neighbors went about their errands, and the world seemed unchanged to anyone who had not experienced the echoes of the night. Yet I knew differently. My mother and I had traversed a space that belonged neither fully to the past nor entirely to the present. We had been reminded of the strength that lived quietly in her, a strength that had carried her through years of fear and loss, and a strength that had guided me, her daughter, toward understanding the weight of survival. That day I learned that history is not always confined to books or photographs. It lives in actions, in the trembling of hands, in the instinctive knowledge of what to do when fear returns. And in that knowledge, I found a deeper connection to my mother, a recognition of her courage, and the certainty that even decades later, the echoes of survival could teach lessons too profound for ordinary conversation. As I lay in bed that night, I realized that understanding her past was not only about witnessing events, but about feeling them, letting them shape the empathy and strength that define who I have become. Several months after the night the sirens returned, I began exploring the family albums that had always been tucked away in the living room cabinet. My mother rarely allowed me to handle them, insisting they were fragile and that some memories were not yet ready to be shared. But after the letters in the attic and the stories she had started revealing, I felt I was finally old enough to see the faces frozen in time, the evidence of lives shaped by fear, hope, and endurance. The first album I opened was thick, bound in worn leather with a faint scent of age and paper. I flipped carefully through the pages, observing photographs of my mother as a child. Standing with neighbors I had never met, children whose laughter no longer echoed in the streets of Bristol. In many of the photos, her eyes seemed older than her years, reflective and serious, capturing a depth of understanding that only hardship can teach. I paused at one picture of her holding a small basket of bread, her expression a mixture of pride and worry. I realized she was carrying more than groceries. She was carrying responsibility, survival, and the burden of watching over those around her. As I continued, I discovered images of the city itself, buildings scarred by bombs, streets blocked by rubble, and families posed in front of what remained of their homes. I could see the contrast between destruction and determination. There were also photographs of my grandfather, young and stern, standing beside neighbors who had endured the same trials. His presence in these images was commanding yet protective. I noticed the way he often positioned himself between children and danger, a silent guardian in moments captured only by a shutter. Some photographs were accompanied by brief notes in my mother's handwriting. They described small acts of courage, sharing what little food remained, finding shelter during bombings, comforting a frightened friend in the middle of the night. These annotations revealed details not present in the images themselves. Details that transformed static scenes into living narratives of struggle and resilience. Through her words, I felt the heartbeat of the past, alive and present in ways I had not expected. One image in particular struck me. My mother was crouched beside a group of children, her arms wrapped protectively around them, while the ruins of a building loomed behind. Her face was pale, her eyes alert, her posture tense. I could almost hear her thoughts, a mixture of fear for the children, concern for her own safety, and the determination to ensure that life continued despite the chaos surrounding them. The photograph was both haunting and inspiring, a silent testimony to the courage she had shown and the resilience she had nurtured in others. I began arranging the photos chronologically on the living room floor, trying to trace the story they told. As I worked, my mother watched quietly from her chair. She didn't interrupt, but her gaze lingered on certain images, particularly those of her younger self. Occasionally, she would nod or exhale softly, as if each photograph carried a memory she had almost forgotten. The room was filled with a quiet reverence, an understanding that these images were not merely pictures, they were pieces of a lived experience, fragments of history preserved in the faces and settings captured by those who had witnessed them. By the time I finished, I had a clear sense of the life she had endured, the challenges she had faced, and the strength she had carried into adulthood. The photographs, alongside the letters and stories, created a mosaic of memory that allowed me to see my mother not only as a parent, but as a survivor. I understood, perhaps for the first time, that her silence had been a shield her stories, a gift she chose to reveal only when the time was right, and her life a testament to endurance beyond what I could have imagined. That evening, we spoke quietly about the images, sharing observations, acknowledging what had been difficult to endure, and celebrating small victories that had allowed us to live and grow. The photographs became a bridge, connecting us to the past while strengthening the bond we shared in the present. They reminded me that memory is both fragile and powerful, and that by preserving and honoring these moments, we ensure that the courage of those who came before us continues to shape our lives and the generations that follow. As I lay in bed that night, I reflected on the profound lessons these photographs had taught me. Survival, I realized, is not only about avoiding harm, it's about remembering, understanding, and honoring the lives and choices of those who carried the weight of history in silence. My mother's past was no longer a shadow. It was a foundation, a story I was entrusted to carry forward, just as she had carried it before me. It was a late summer evening when my mother finally told me the story she had carried for decades. I had been visiting her in Bristol, the air warm but heavy with the humidity that seemed to settle in the city after a long, quiet day. We were sitting in the living room, the same room where the family photographs had been spread across the floor weeks before. The letters from the attic lay in a neat stack beside us, and I could see her eyes lingering on them as though they were both a reminder of the past and a warning of what she was about to share. She began quietly, her voice almost a whisper at first, as though speaking too loudly might disturb the memories themselves. She told me about the early days of the war, when she was only 10 years old, and how the world she had known was transformed overnight. The streets of Bristol, usually bustling and familiar, became places of fear, where shadows were amplified by flickering lamplight and the sound of distant sirens made every step uncertain. She described the nights spent in cramped shelters, the anxiety of waiting for loved ones to return, and the suffocating silence that often followed the end of an air raid. As she spoke, I could feel the weight of her experiences pressing into the room. The calm, collected woman I had known all my life was now revealing the raw vulnerability she had hidden so carefully. She described friends who had disappeared, homes destroyed, and the sense of helplessness that had pervaded every corner of her life. Yet she also spoke of the resilience that had grown within her, the courage required to continue, and the small acts of kindness that had reminded her, even in the darkest times, that life could persist. I listened, rapt, feeling as though I were traveling through her memories alongside her. She told me about nights when the sky glowed with the reflection of bombs falling on distant parts of the city, when she held younger children close, whispering reassurances she barely believed herself. She spoke of hunger and exhaustion, of rationing and scarcity, and the constant awareness that survival was never guaranteed. And yet, amidst the hardship, she remembered moments of laughter stolen from the shadows, moments that had kept her humanity intact. As the story unfolded, I noticed the subtle tremor in her hands, the way her eyes darted occasionally toward the window, as if expecting the horrors she had once known to return. I held her hand in mine, letting her know that she was no longer alone, that the past, while unchangeable, could now be shared. This act, so simple yet profound, seemed to release a tension she had carried for decades. Her voice became steadier as she spoke, yet every word carried the echoes of fear, strength, and survival intertwined. She also spoke about my grandfather, whose presence during those years had been both protective and steadfast. She recounted his quiet determination, the way he ensured the safety of the neighborhood children, and how he carried the burden of responsibility without complaint. She painted a vivid picture of a man shaped by duty, love, and the unrelenting demands of a world at war. Through her words, I understood not only her courage, but the legacy of resilience that had been passed down to me. By the end of the night, I had learned more about my mother's childhood than I ever could have imagined. The room was heavy with the weight of her story, yet it was also filled with relief, with the sense that years of silent endurance had finally found a voice. I realized that the courage I had seen in her all my life was born from these experiences, from the unimaginable trials she had faced, and the strength she had cultivated to survive them. As she finished speaking, we sat together in silence, the letters and photographs surrounding us like witnesses to her journey. I felt a profound connection to her past, a deep understanding of the events that had shaped her, and a respect for the resilience that had allowed her to nurture and protect me despite the shadows of her youth. That night, I understood that survival is not just about enduring danger, it is about carrying the memories forward, learning from them, and allowing those who come after to understand the courage that made their lives possible. It was a quiet morning in Bristol, the kind of day when the sky hangs low with clouds and the city seems to hold its breath. I had returned home to visit my mother, now 77, and for some reason I sensed that today would be different. There was a weight in the air, subtle but unmistakable, as if the house itself anticipated what was about to unfold. I found her in the kitchen, arranging cups for tea, her movements slow yet deliberate. She glanced at me with a hint of apprehension in her eyes, and I understood immediately that the moment we had both been waiting for had arrived. We sat down at the table, the letters from the attic stacked neatly beside us. Photographs spread across the counter, each image a frozen echo of the past. She took a deep breath and began to speak, not in fragments or whispers this time, but in a continuous flow, a story she had carried silently for over 70 years. She told me about the earliest days of the war, the sounds of distant planes, the shouts of neighbors, and the nights spent in shelters that smelled of damp earth and fear. She described the hunger, the uncertainty, and the constant awareness that every day could bring danger. Her voice was steady, but carried the weight of decades, and as she spoke, I felt a profound connection to the child she once was. She told me about the moments that had terrified her most the day her home was bombed while she slept. The sudden loss of friends, the displacement of families who had nowhere to go. She spoke of fear and desperation, but also of hope and resilience, of the small acts of courage that kept people alive and connected. I listened in silence, absorbing every word, every pause, every tremor in her voice that revealed the depth of what she had endured. She recounted specific memories with clarity, holding hands with younger children as they ran through streets shattered by bombs, sharing meager meals with neighbors to ensure no one went hungry, and comforting those who had lost everything. Her stories were vivid, painted with emotion and detail, and I realized how carefully she had chosen which moments to reveal, each one carrying lessons about survival, humanity, and the strength required to endure unimaginable hardship. As the hours passed, she spoke about the emotional toll the war had taken, not only on her, but on the entire community. She described neighbors who had lost loved ones, families torn apart, and the lingering fear that never fully dissipated even after peace was declared. Yet she also spoke of resilience, of the bonds formed in adversity, of how communities supported one another when the world seemed determined to break them. Her reflections were not only personal, but universal, capturing the essence of a generation that had survived against overwhelming odds. At one point, she paused and looked directly at me. Her eyes, still strong and alert, held a depth I had never fully appreciated. She explained why she had remained silent for so long, why she had protected me from the darkness she had known. It was not out of shame or fear, she said, but because some memories carry burdens too heavy for those not yet ready to bear them. She wanted me to grow, to live, to understand the world without being weighed down by the horrors she had endured. Now, she trusted that I was ready. I asked her questions, and she answered with patience and honesty, never avoiding the difficult parts, yet framing each memory with the perspective of survival and learning. She described the fear, the loss, and the moments of despair, but also emphasized courage, hope, and the profound capacity for humans to endure. By the time she finished, I felt I had been given a gift. The complete story of her experience, shared not through fragments or hints, but fully, with trust and love. The room fell silent afterward, filled only with the weight of what had been shared. I felt a mixture of awe, gratitude, and sorrow for the trials she had faced. I understood now that her silence had been a shield, her strength a quiet guide, and her willingness to finally speak a testament to the trust between mother and daughter. The letters, photographs, and stories were no longer separate fragments. Together, they formed a complete picture of resilience, endurance, and the power of survival. As I held her hand that afternoon, I realized the profound impact of what she had shared. It was more than a recounting of history, it was a legacy of courage, a blueprint for strength, and a deeply personal lesson about the endurance of the human spirit. I knew then that I would carry her story with me for the rest of my life, honoring the struggles she had faced, the love she had protected, and the resilience that had shaped not only her life but mine as well. The war, the fear, the loss, they were no longer distant shadows. They were part of my mother, part of our family, and now, through her words, part of me too.